Nothing cuts deeper than the betrayal of your own blood. No parent should ever face the choice between justice and love when their child becomes their enemy. Viking warrior Ulvar Ironborn returns home early from battle, his heart full of joy at surprising his family. But the surprise is his. His wife Brynja lies chained in their doorway like a slave, dying of thirst. Inside, his son Rurik celebrates with warriors, declaring himself master of the house. Rurik has claimed his father's throne, his father's authority, and left his own mother to suffer. Now Ulvar stands at his own threshold, axe in hand, facing the most terrible choice a father can make. His son has crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. But can a father's love find a way to heal what seems broken forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjords like the breath of sleeping gods when Ulvar Ironborn had first departed Elfheim 3 moons past. His weathered hands had trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of leaving, as he fastened his battle-worn cloak around broad shoulders that had carried the hopes of his people for 20 winters. Brynja had stood in their doorway then, her silver wedding ring catching the dawn light as she pressed warm bread into his travel pouch. The runic inscriptions on that simple band told their story. 2 souls bound by honor, strengthened by struggle, blessed by the gods. She was 43 winters old, her auburn hair now streaked with silver threads that caught moonlight like spun treasure. But her green eyes still held the fire that had captured his heart. When they were both young and foolish enough to believe love conquered. All 3 moons feels like 3 years, she had whispered against his chest, her voice carrying the weight of a woman who had watched too many warriors ride away and not all return. The trading season in Miklagard will be profitable, Ulvar had replied, stroking her hair with calloused fingers that knew both the touch of sword hilts and the gentleness required for a wife's tears. When I return, we'll have enough silver to expand the long house, perhaps even try once more for another child. Brynja had finished, her hand moving instinctively to her belly where hope had died too many times before. Ulvar Ironborn was not a man given to dreams, but in that moment he had allowed himself to imagine their home filled with the laughter of little feet again. Rurik had been 25 winters then, strong and capable, but something in his son's eyes had begun to trouble Ulvar in recent seasons. A hunger that went beyond normal ambition, a resentment that surfaced whenever village elders praised his father's wisdom, or when warriors spoke of following Ulvar's banner into battle. Father grows old, Rurik had said to his drinking companions just 2 nights before Ulvar's departure, his voice carrying across the great hall where shadows danced with firelight. His sword arm weakens, his judgment falters. Ulvar had heard these words from the alcove where he sat repairing his mail, each syllable striking like hammer blows against his heart. 25 years of raising this boy, of teaching him honor, of showing him what it meant to lead with wisdom rather than force. And yet, you speak foolishness, Rurik, old Gunnar had replied, his scarred face grave in the firelight. Gunnar had sailed with Ulvar for 15 years, had seen him split shields and crack skulls from the Hebrides to Constantinople. Your father's reputation reaches from here to the halls of kings. Men follow Ulvar Ironborn because they trust him, not because they fear him. But Rurik had only laughed, a sound devoid of the warmth that had once characterized the boy who used to beg for bedtime stories of distant lands. Trust is a luxury, old man. Power is a necessity. When I lead this settlement, things will change. The words had chilled Ulvar more than any North Sea wind. This was not the ambitious young man he had hoped to pass his legacy to, but something darker, someone who saw leadership as taking rather than giving, who confused authority with domination. Still, Ulvar had chosen to believe in the better nature of his son, chosen to trust that responsibility would temper Rurik's harder edges, that managing Elfheim in his father's absence would teach him the weight of true leadership. How could a father do otherwise? The journey to Miklagard had been profitable indeed. The Byzantine merchants hungered for northern furs and amber, paying in silver that would feed Elfheim through 2 hard winters. Ulvar's reputation as an honorable trader had opened doors that remained closed to other Viking chieftains, allowing him to negotiate deals that enriched not just his own household, but every family under his protection. During the long nights aboard his dragon-proud ship, with salt spray stinging his weathered face and stars wheeling overhead like distant campfires, Ulvar had composed letters to Brynja in his mind. He would tell her of the wonders he had seen, the great walls of Constantinople rising from the sea like something from the god's own dreams, the markets filled with spices that made the air itself seem magical, the scholars who spoke of lands so distant that even their names sounded like poetry. But mostly, he had thought of home, of Brynja's laugh when he surprised her with silk from far Cathay, of Rurik's pride when his father returned with enough wealth to ensure their settlement's prosperity for years to come. Perhaps his son would finally understand that true strength lay not in the sword arm, but in the bonds between people, in the trust that made men follow you into darkness because they knew you would lead them back to light. The weather had favored his return voyage. Winds that should have been contrary filled his square sail, pushing his longship through familiar waters with unusual speed. 3 days ahead of schedule, Ulvar had watched the familiar peaks of home rise from morning, mist like old friends, welcoming him back to everything he held dear. His heart had sung with anticipation as they navigated the narrow inlet that led to Elfheim's harbor. Soon he would feel Brynja's arms around him, would taste her bread still warm from the oven, would sit by his own fire and share tales of distant shores with his son. The silver in his ship's hold represented more than wealth. It represented security, legacy, the promise of peaceful years ahead where he could focus on being a husband and father rather than a warrior. But gods, how wrong he had been. The first sign that something was amiss came when he saw no lookouts posted at the harbor entrance. Elfheim's safety depended on vigilance, on knowing who approached their waters, yet the watchtower stood empty against the morning sky. Ulvar's warrior instincts, honed by decades of survival, began to whisper warnings, but his father's heart silenced them. Perhaps Rurik had simply grown confident in peaceful times. Perhaps the second sign struck him like a physical blow. His dragon ship, the Sea Wolf, was gone from its mooring. Not taken by raiders, there would have been signs of battle, wreckage, blood. Simply absent, as if someone had the authority to command its use. Only 2 people in Elfheim held that authority. Ulvar himself, and in his absence his son. But why would Rurik take the ship without sending word? What business required the Sea Wolf's presence elsewhere when harvest season approached, and every hand was needed for the work of survival? Walking up the familiar path from harbor to settlement, Ulvar's unease deepened with each step. The village seemed prosperous enough. Smoke rose from chimneys, animals grazed in their pens, but something felt wrong in ways his mind couldn't yet articulate. Men looked away when they saw him approaching, their faces holding expressions he couldn't read but didn't like. "Jarl Ulvar," called Thorvald the smith, his hammer falling silent on his anvil. "You've returned early." "Favorable winds," Ulvar replied, searching the man's weathered face for clues to the tension he sensed. "Is all well in Elfheim?" Thorvald's eyes shifted toward the great hall, then back to his work. "Your son leads in your absence, as is proper." The words were correct, but the tone carried undertones that made Ulvar's hand unconsciously drift toward his sword hilt. He had known Thorvald for 10 years, had fought beside him in 2 raids, had helped deliver his youngest daughter when the midwife was absent. This was not how an old friend greeted a returning leader. As Ulvar approached his long house, the great hall that had been his grandfather's and his father's, before him he could hear sounds of celebration from within. Laughter, the clash of drinking horns, voices raised in song and boasting. His heart lifted slightly. Perhaps Rurik was celebrating some victory, some successful negotiation or profitable venture. Perhaps his son had grown into the leader Ulvar had always hoped he would become. But then he heard Rurik's voice, rising above the others. And the words that reached his ears turned his blood to ice water. "The old man's reign is finished," Rurik declared. His words slurred with ale, but carrying absolute conviction. "I am master of this hall now, master of this settlement. Those who challenge me will learn what happens to those who mistake mercy for weakness." Ulvar stood frozen in the shadows outside his own door, listening to his son's voice proclaim his obsolescence to an audience that seemed all too willing to believe it. This was not celebration, this was revolution. This was betrayal of the deepest kind, played out in the very hall where Ulvar had taught Rurik to walk, to speak, to hold a sword. But where was Brynja? Why did he not hear his wife's voice among the revelers? Why had she not come to greet him at the harbour, as she always did when he returned from any journey longer than a day? The answer to that question would haunt him forever. There, beside the great oak door that had welcomed him home from countless journeys, lay his wife. Brynja, who should have been warm in their bed or busy with her weaving, was chained like a slave to the very threshold of their home. Iron shackles bound her wrists and ankles, the metal cold and cruel against skin that should know only gentle touches. Her lips were cracked from thirst, her once bright eyes dulled with exhaustion and something worse, shame. The sight struck Ulvar like a physical blow, driving all breath from his lungs. This was Brynja, his beloved, the woman who had stood beside him through 23 years of marriage, who had borne his child, who had made their house a home worth defending. Now she lay broken outside their own door, while inside their son celebrated his assumption of power. For a heartbeat, Ulvar's mind refused to accept what his eyes were showing him. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Sons didn't chain their own mothers. Sons didn't leave the women who gave them life to die of thirst outside their own homes. But the evidence was undeniable. And with that acceptance came a rage so pure and terrible that it threatened to consume everything in its path. His hand closed around the haft of his war axe, the weapon that had carved his reputation from the shores of England to the walls of Constantinople. Justice demanded satisfaction. Honor required vengeance. Yet beneath the rage, deeper than fury, a father's heart continued to beat. Somewhere in that hall, drunk on power and surrounded by sycophants, was the boy he had raised. The child who had once fallen asleep in his lap during long winter evenings. The son who had begged to hear just one more story before bedtime. How do you choose between justice and love when they demand opposite actions? How do you balance the scales when your heart weighs as much as your honor? Standing in the shadows outside his own home, with his wife's suffering before his eyes and his son's betrayal ringing in his ears, Ulvar Ironborn faced the most terrible choice any father can confront. What do you do when love and duty point in different directions? Ulvar knelt beside Brynja with hands that trembled not from age, but from the careful control required to touch something so precious and broken. Her skin felt cold as winter stone beneath his calloused fingers, yet when she opened her eyes at his touch, recognition flared like embers finding air. "Ulvar," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath. "You came home." The simple words shattered something in his chest. Of course he had come home. He had always come home to her, through storm and battle, through injury and hardship. But the wonder in her voice told him she had not expected to live long enough to see him again. "Water," he said, reaching for the drinking horn at his belt, but she caught his wrist with fingers weak as bird bones. "Not yet," Brynja breathed. "Listen first. Understand what you face before you act." Inside the hall, Rurik's voice rose again in drunken boasting. "My father clings to old ways, old weaknesses. He builds with treaties what should be taken by strength. He offers friendship to those who deserve only fear." Each word was a blade between Ulvar's ribs. This was how his son spoke of him to others. This was the legacy 25 years of fatherhood had earned. "Tell me," Ulvar said to his wife, though every instinct screamed at him to burst through those doors with axe singing. Brynja's eyes found his, and in them he saw not just physical pain, but a deeper wound that might never heal. "It began the very night you left. Rurik called a gathering of the young warriors, those hungry for quick glory rather than earned honor. He spoke of change, of new leadership for new times, and the village elders. Gunnar, Thorvald, challenged him at first, Brynja managed, accepting a careful sip of water from Ulvar's horn. But Rurik was clever. He didn't seize power, he demonstrated it. Small things at first, changing work assignments without consulting the council, taking larger portions at feasts, claiming better hunting grounds for his friends. Ulvar's jaw clenched. These were not the actions of legitimate authority, but of a usurper testing boundaries. When did it become this? He asked, gesturing at her chains. 2 weeks ago, Brynja said, and her voice carried such shame that Ulvar wanted to gather her up and carry her somewhere safe, where she never had to feel that way again. I spoke against him in the council meeting, reminded everyone that he ruled only in your absence, not in your place. That when you returned, what did he do? He laughed, she said, and the memory clearly still wounded her. He laughed and told everyone that perhaps his mother needed to learn the same lessons as the rest of the settlement. That respect wasn't given freely, but earned through strength. The metal shackles around her wrists caught moonlight, and Ulvar saw they were well made. Expensive iron, not hastily forged restraints, but something prepared, planned. His son hadn't acted in anger. He had calculated this humiliation. He had Torkel and Bjorn drag me here, Brynja continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke, as if telling the truth was restoring some part of her spirit. Said I could remain his father's wife when I learned to be his subject first. Said, her voice broke. What else did he say? That when you returned, you would find a new order in Elfheim, one that had no place for weak women or weak leaders. From inside the hall came a crash, as something heavy hit the floor, followed by raucous laughter. Ulvar could picture it clearly, his son holding court in the high seat that had been carved by Ulvar's grandfather, drinking from the silver cups that were meant for honored guests, surrounded by men who saw opportunity in chaos. Who stands with him? Ulvar asked. Too many, Brynja admitted. The young ones who think raiding brings more honor than trading. Some of the thralls who believe Rurik's promises of freedom and shares in plunder. Even a few of the older warriors who think, she paused. Who think what? Who think perhaps you've grown too soft for the changing times? That your way of leadership belongs to a more peaceful age. Each name felt like another weight, added to a burden Ulvar wasn't sure he could carry. These were men he had fought beside, men whose children he had held as babes, men who had sworn oaths to follow him, and who remains loyal. Gunnar, though Rurik has forbidden him the hall. Thorvald speaks carefully, but I see his true feelings. Young Eric still asks after you. Maybe a dozen others who remember what loyalty means. A dozen men against how many? 30, 40. Ulvar's mind calculated odds automatically. Too few loyal swords to simply overwhelm Rurik's supporters, too many enemies to face without careful planning. The Seawolf? Sailed 2 days ago with 20 men. Rurik claims they're trading down the coast, but he's positioning himself for when I return, Ulvar finished. Remove potential allies, ensure he controls the strongest warriors. Inside, someone began beating out a rhythm on the table, while voices rose in a crude song about weak old men being replaced by strong young wolves. The words were clearly meant to be heard outside, meant to demonstrate Rurik's confidence in his position. Ulvar studied his wife's face in the moonlight. She had been the strongest woman he'd ever known, capable of managing a household of 30 people, skilled enough to negotiate with traders from distant lands, wise enough to counsel him through difficult decisions. To see her reduced to this, chained and thirsting outside her own home, filled him with a rage so pure it threatened to overwhelm thought itself. He means to kill you, Brynja said quietly. Not immediately, not openly, but he can't let you live to challenge him. An accident during a hunt, perhaps, or an attack by raiders he hired himself. The words should have surprised Ulvar, but they didn't. He had seen enough of politics and power to recognize the logic. A usurper who allowed his predecessor to live was a usurper who lived in constant fear of losing everything. And after he becomes Jarl in truth, marries me to some ally to legitimize his rule, or more likely. She stopped, More likely what? More likely find some excuse to declare me unfit as well. Claims I've been unfaithful in your absence, or that I'm too old to bear heirs. Then he's free to marry younger, to build alliances with other ambitious families. The calculated cruelty of it struck Ulvar like physical blows. This wasn't just rebellion. This was the complete destruction of everything he had built, everything he cared about. His marriage, his legacy, his people's welfare, all sacrificed to his son's hunger for power, the silver from Miklagard. Already claimed, Brynja said with bitter satisfaction. Rurik sent men to search your ship the moment the lookouts reported your return. He was expecting you tomorrow. That's why tonight's celebration. One final feast before dealing with his father. So even his early return, which should have been an advantage, was known and planned for. Rurik had watchers, informants, a network of support that Ulvar was only beginning to understand. From inside came Rurik's voice again, this time in a tone Ulvar recognized from the boy's childhood. The same voice he'd used when boasting about victories he hadn't earned or accomplishments he hadn't achieved. Tomorrow, my friends, we stop pretending. Tomorrow, we make it clear to everyone in Elfheim that a new age has begun. An age where strength rules, where warriors take what they deserve instead of begging for scraps. From weak leaders who've forgotten what it means to be Viking, the cheers that greeted these words told Ulvar everything he needed to know about how many of his people his son had turned against him. This wasn't a handful of malcontents. This was a significant portion of his settlement, seduced by promises of easy wealth and the romantic notion that strength alone made right. "What will you do?" Brynja asked, though her eyes already held the knowledge that whatever he chose would tear him apart. Ulvar looked at his wife, broken by their son's cruelty. He listened to that son claiming his authority, his hall, his legacy. He thought of the dozen men who remained loyal, and the 30 or more who had been turned against him. Justice demanded he kick down that door and take his axe to every man inside who had participated in this betrayal. Honor required he defend his wife, his position, his people's welfare against a usurper who understood power but not responsibility. But love for a son he had raised. A boy he had taught to walk and fight and lead. Love whispered that perhaps there was still time to save Rurik from himself. Perhaps a father's wisdom could still reach whatever remained of the child, buried beneath this hunger for power. "I don't know," Ulvar admitted, the hardest words he'd ever spoken. "I don't know." The admission hung in the night air between them, heavy with all the choices that lay ahead. Inside the hall, his son continued his celebration. Unaware that his father had returned early, unaware that the reckoning he had planned was about to begin. Tonight instead of tomorrow, but as Ulvar knelt beside his chained wife and listened to his son's voice proclaiming the end of everything he had built, he realized that some choices couldn't be postponed forever. Some lines, once crossed, changed everything that came after. Whether he chose justice or mercy, whether he drew his axe or extended his hand, nothing would ever be the same again. The first thing Ulvar did was carry Brynja to safety, not to their marriage bed, that felt defiled by Rurik's presence in their home, but to old Gunnar's cottage at the settlement's edge. The loyal warrior's eyes blazed with fury when he saw Brynja's condition, his scarred hands gentle as he helped settle her on his own sleeping furs. "I should have acted sooner," Gunnar said, his voice thick with shame. "Should have gathered the loyal men and ended this madness weeks ago." "With what?" Ulvar asked quietly, accepting a cup of heated wine from Gunnar's wife, Astrid. "Rurik commands the hall, most of the weapons, the majority of warriors. Open rebellion would have meant bloodshed with no certainty of victory." But even as he spoke the reasonable words, Ulvar felt the weight of his own restraint. Reasonable men didn't always win. Sometimes reasonable men watched everything they loved slip away while they calculated odds and considered consequences. Astrid knelt beside Brynja with herbs for healing and water for thirst. She was a woman who had raised 6 children and buried 2, who knew both tenderness and strength. Her touch brought color back to Brynja's pale cheeks, but Ulvar could see the deeper damage would take longer to heal. "What news of the others?" Ulvar asked Gunnar as they stepped outside to speak privately. Eric still asks after you daily. Young Harold grows uneasy with Rurik's commands. He's too honorable for what your son has become. Thorvald speaks carefully, but his hammer strikes with anger when he thinks no one watches. And the rest? Gunnar's expression darkened, seduced by promises of easy wealth. Rurik tells them you've grown soft from trading instead of raiding, that real Vikings take what they want, rather than negotiating for it. He speaks of grand expeditions to Ireland, of halls full of silver and slaves. Dreams, Ulvar said. The Irish kings are stronger now, better organized. Those easy raids ended with our father's generation. You know that. I know that. But young men hungry for glory don't want to hear about changed times and harder realities. They want to believe their strength alone can conquer the world. Through the darkness, they could see light spilling from the great hall's windows, could hear voices raised in songs that grew cruder as the night wore on. Ulvar's hall, built by his grandfather's hands, had become the center of his own son's rebellion. There's something else, Gunnar said hesitantly. Rurik has been meeting with messengers, men from other settlements. Some I recognize from the Orkney Jarls. Ulvar's blood chilled. If Rurik was making alliances with external powers, this was no longer just a family dispute. It was potential warfare that could consume the entire region. What kind of alliances? Marriage pacts, I think. Rurik has been boasting about choosing a new wife from among the Orkney chieftains' daughters. Someone who can bring warriors and ships to strengthen his position. The implications struck Ulvar like physical blows. Not only was Rurik planning to dispose of Brynja, but he was already negotiating her replacement. Planning not just usurpation, but dynasty, not just power, but permanent change. When are these meetings? 3 days hence at the new moon. Representatives from 5 settlements will gather to hear Rurik's proposals. 3 days. If Ulvar was going to act, it had to be before those alliances were sealed. Once Rurik had external support, removing him would mean war between settlements. Exactly the kind of destructive conflict Ulvar had spent decades preventing. How many men can we trust absolutely? Ulvar asked. Gunnar considered carefully. 8, maybe 10, if we include some of the older warriors who remember their oaths. Not enough for a direct assault, but enough for other purposes. Depends what you have in mind. Ulvar looked back toward his hall, where his son held court like a conquering king. Every instinct trained by decades of leadership told him to strike fast, to end this before it grew worse. But every instinct trained by fatherhood begged him to find another way. I want to speak with him, Ulvar said finally. Alone, away from his supporters. Maybe there's still something left of the boy I raised. Gunnar's expression was skeptical, but not dismissive. That's dangerous. If he's planning to kill you anyway, then at least I'll know I tried everything before I chose the harder path. Inside the cottage, Astrid was helping Brynja sip warm broth. His wife's eyes found Ulvar's through the doorway, and in them he saw both understanding and fear. She knew him well enough to recognize the conflict tearing him apart. He won't listen, Brynja said quietly, when Ulvar returned to her side. Whatever you see in him, whatever you remember of the child he was, it's gone. I've watched it die piece by piece these last months, perhaps, Ulvar admitted. But I have to know for certain. I have to be able to say I offered him the chance to step back from this path, and if he refuses, if he tries to kill you during this meeting. Ulvar's hand moved to the war axe at his belt, the weapon that had never failed him in 30 years of conflict. Then I'll know my son is truly lost, and I'll act accordingly. The words tasted bitter in his mouth. How did a father prepare himself to kill his own child? How did a man balance love against justice when both demanded everything he had to give? There's a place, Gunnar said from the doorway. The old shrine to Thor up the mountain path. Sacred ground where blood cannot be shed. If you could draw him there, he'd never come alone, Ulvar said. Too suspicious. Not alone, Gunnar agreed. But with only a few men. On sacred ground, surrounded by witnesses, even Rurik would hesitate to attempt murder. It was a possibility, though a dangerous one. The shrine was a day's walk up steep mountain paths. far from the settlement and any chance of rescue if things went wrong. But it was also the kind of dramatic gesture that might appeal to Rurik's sense of destiny, his need to be seen as a worthy successor. "I need to think," Ulvar said, "and I need to see who else remains loyal before I make any moves." "Be careful who you approach," Astrid warned. "Rurik has ears everywhere now. Men who might have remained neutral before are choosing sides based on fear rather than honor. That was the curse of usurpation. It forced everyone to make choices they shouldn't have to make, to risk everything they had built for the sake of political survival. Good men became informants, loyal warriors became turncoats, all because the normal order of things had been shattered by one man's ambition. "Tomorrow," Ulvar decided, "tomorrow I'll make quiet contact with those we can trust. Learn exactly where we stand, what resources we have, what options remain open. And tonight," Gunnar asked. Ulvar looked at his wife, exhausted and wounded, but safe for the moment in the warmth of a loyal friend's home. He thought of his son, drunk on power and surrounded by men who saw him as a path to easy wealth. He considered the silver from Miklagard, already claimed by a usurper, and the reputation built over decades, now crumbling under accusations of weakness. "Tonight I try to remember that 3 days ago I was a successful trader returning home to his family," Ulvar said quietly. "Tonight I try to understand how everything I thought I knew about my life could be so completely wrong." Outside, the celebration in his hall continued, his son's voice rising above the others in songs of conquest and glory. Inside Gunnar's cottage, his wife slept fitfully on borrowed furs, occasionally whimpering as old wounds reminded her of recent cruelties. Between those two realities lay the space where Ulvar Ironborn would have to choose what kind of man he was willing to become. Dawn brought no comfort to Ulvar Ironborn. He woke on Gunnar's floor to the sound of his wife's labored breathing, and the distant noise of his settlement already beginning its daily work under his son's authority. Through the small window, he could see smoke rising from the great hall's kitchens. Rurik was feeding his supporters well, ensuring their loyalty with full bellies and generous portions. "He's consolidated faster than I expected," Gunnar said quietly, returning from an early reconnaissance of the village. "Posted guards at the armory, the silver stores, even the grain houses. Your son understands the mechanics of power." Ulvar accepted a bowl of thin porridge, though his stomach rebelled against food. "What of our people? How do they seem this morning?" "Subdued. Some clearly regret last night's excesses, but fear keeps them silent. Rurik made an announcement at dawn. Anyone caught speaking with the former Jarl without permission will be exiled. So even conversation with his own people was now forbidden." Ulvar marveled at how thoroughly his son had thought this through, how completely he had anticipated every avenue of potential resistance. "There's worse news," Gunnar continued, his weathered face grim. 3 more families declared for Rurik this morning. The Erikssons, the Bjornsons, and young Leif with his brothers. Each name hit like a physical blow. These were families Ulvar had protected, men whose children he had blessed, households that had prospered under his leadership. Now they saw opportunity in his downfall, fear or greed. Ulvar asked, "Both." Rurik promises rich shares in future raids for those who support him early, and he's made it clear that neutrality isn't an option. You're either with the new order or against it. Brynja stirred on her sleeping furs, and Ulvar moved to her side. The night's rest had restored some strength, but her eyes still held the shadow of what she had endured. "I've been thinking about the messengers," she said without preamble. "The ones from Orkney. I know who leads that delegation. Tell me, Ragnar Bloodaxe's younger son, Hakon, ambitious, ruthless, looking to establish his own power base. If he allies with Rurik, then we face not just internal rebellion, but external invasion," Ulvar finished. "Hakon would bring 200 warriors if the price was right, and what price would Rurik pay?" Brynja's eyes met his, both of them understanding the implications. Marriage alliance with a local chieftain's daughter would give Hakon legitimacy here. Control over Elfheim's trade routes would give him wealth. and removing an established Jarl would give him a reputation for decisive action, while Rurik gets warriors to secure his usurpation and allies to defend against any counterattack. Gunnar added, "It's cleverly done, too cleverly." This wasn't the impulsive action of a young man drunk on ambition. This was careful planning, strategic thinking, the kind of political maneuvering that took time and patience to arrange. How long had Rurik been planning this betrayal? How many months had he smiled at his father's table while plotting his father's downfall? "I need to know more about these alliances," Ulvar said. "Who else has Rurik contacted? What promises has he made? What does he plan for after he's eliminated me?" "That's information we can't get safely," Gunnar warned. "Anyone close enough to Rurik to know his full plans is either completely loyal to him or too terrified to speak." "Not everyone," Brynja said thoughtfully. "There's one person who might know everything but hasn't chosen sides yet." "Who?" "Sigrid," Ulvar's breath caught. Sigrid the Wise was the settlement's Völva, the seer woman whose counsel both Jarls and common folk sought in times of crisis. She was older than memory, sharper than any blade, and owed loyalty to the gods rather than to any earthly leader. "Would she speak with me?" "She might," Brynja said. "She's been conspicuously absent from Rurik's celebrations. And she knew your father well. She might remember debts of honor that go deeper than current politics. It was dangerous. Visiting the Völva would require crossing the settlement, risking recognition, possibly walking into a trap. But it was also their best hope of understanding exactly what they faced and what options remained. "Tonight," Ulvar decided, "after the evening meal when attention is focused on the hall. Gunnar, can you arrange a distraction? Thorvald owes me several favors. Perhaps a small fire in his forge, something requiring many hands to contain, but threatening no real damage. And if Sigrid refuses to help?" Brynja asked. Ulvar considered this. The Völva was bound by laws older than kings, answerable to powers greater than earthly authority. She might see this conflict as beneath her concern, or worse. She might have received omens suggesting that Rurik's path was ordained by fate. "Then we'll know that the gods themselves have abandoned me," Ulvar said quietly. "And I'll stop looking for ways to avoid what may be inevitable." The words hung heavy in the small cottage. Outside, they could hear the sounds of normal daily life, continuing under abnormal circumstances. Children playing games, women washing clothes, men going about their work as if the world hadn't fundamentally changed overnight. "There's something else we need to consider," Gunnar said reluctantly. "If Rurik is planning to eliminate you, he won't wait long. Every day you remain alive is another day for potential resistance to organize. My guess is he'll move against you within the week." "How?" "Hunting accident would be cleanest. Invite you to hunt, arrange for arrows to go astray, claim it was tragic misfortune. Or perhaps a challenge to single combat. Frame it as honorable. Let his supporters witness your death in fair fight." Ulvar's hand moved automatically to his sword hilt. Single combat held no terrors for him. He had been fighting longer than Rurik had been alive, had killed men in battles across half the known world. But his son was young, strong, and would fight with the desperate fury of someone who knew defeat meant death. "Could you win?" Brynja asked, reading his thoughts. "In fair combat?" "Yes, I believe so. But would it be fair? Would Rurik fight honorably? Or would he stack the odds as he's done with everything else?" "Poisoned weapons," Gunnar suggested grimly. "Or supporters ready to intervene if the fight goes badly for him. Then I need to be ready for treachery as well as honest combat," Ulvar decided. "But first I need information. Tonight we visit the Völva and learn exactly what we face." As if summoned by their conversation, a commotion arose from the direction of the great hall. Voices raised in anger, the sound of something heavy hitting wood, then silence, more ominous than noise. "What now?" Gunnar muttered, moving toward the window. What they saw chilled them all. A group of Rurik's warriors was dragging someone toward the hall, a young man whose face was bloodied, but whose bearing remained defiant. Even at a distance, Ulvar recognized him. "Eric," he breathed. "Young Eric who still asks after me." "They've taken him," Brynja said, understanding immediately. Rurik is moving faster than we thought. He's eliminating potential resistance before it can organize. Through the morning air came the sound of Rurik's voice, raised so the entire settlement could hear. Let this be a lesson to any who mistake my mercy for weakness. Those who plot against the rightful leadership of Elfheim will face the consequences of their choices. Ulvar's jaw clenched as he watched his son orchestrate another demonstration of power, another lesson in the costs of resistance. Each such display made opposing him more dangerous, made neutrality seem more attractive, made Ulvar's eventual choice between violence and surrender more urgent. Tonight may be too late, Gunnar said quietly. If he's moving against suspected loyalists now, then we accelerate our plans, Ulvar decided. This afternoon, during the noon rest when the settlement sleeps. We visit Sigrid then, before Rurik can eliminate more potential allies. But as they watched Eric being dragged into the hall that should have been a place of justice and protection, Ulvar felt the weight of time pressing against him. Every hour of inaction cost him support, cost him options, cost him the moral authority that came from defending the innocent. How long could a father hesitate when hesitation itself became a form of betrayal, not just of his position, but of everyone who still believed in him? The visit to Sigrid's dwelling required moving through shadows like a thief in his own settlement. Ulvar crept along familiar routes as if he were the intruder rather than the rightful Jarl. Sigrid's hut stood apart from the main settlement, built where forest met fjord and ancient stones marked boundaries older than memory. Smoke rose from her chimney in patterns that seemed deliberate. She knows we're coming, Gunnar muttered as they approached. She always knows. Indeed, the door opened before they could announce themselves, and Sigrid emerged like a figure from old stories, ancient, bent with years, but with eyes sharp as winter stars. Her grey hair hung in braids, woven with bones and silver charms. Ulvar Ironborn, she said, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy. You come seeking wisdom in dark times. I come seeking truth, wise one. My settlement suffers under false leadership, and I would know what path leads to healing. Sigrid studied his face, then stepped aside to let them enter. Her dwelling was filled with herbs hanging from rafters, carved runes covering every surface, and the scent of burning sage. Truth is a blade that cuts both ways, she said, settling onto a chair carved from oak. Are you prepared for wounds that may never heal? I'm prepared for whatever wisdom you offer. The Volva reached into a leather pouch and withdrew carved bone runes, letting them fall onto marked cloth. Her gnarled fingers moved among them, reading patterns. Your son's betrayal runs deeper than you know, she said without looking up. This began not with recent ambition, but with childhood wounds that festered in silence. What wounds? I gave Rurik everything, love, guidance, preparation for leadership. Everything but the one thing he wanted most, Sigrid replied. Your approval. In your eyes he always saw disappointment, always felt measured against standards he could never reach. The words struck Ulvar like blows. That's not true. I was proud of him, but not of his choices. Not of his vision for leadership. The Volva's voice was gentle, but implacable. You raised him to be you. When he tried to be himself, you saw failure where he saw independence. Ulvar's mind raced through years of interactions. Training sessions where he corrected Rurik's form. Council meetings where he questioned suggestions. Feast nights where he redirected conversations away from raids toward trade. I was teaching him wisdom, Ulvar said. But the words sounded hollow. You were teaching him to be ashamed of his nature, Sigrid corrected. A wolf cannot be trained to be a sheep, no matter how often you punish it for showing fangs. Then you're saying his betrayal is justified? That I deserve to find my wife chained like a slave? The Volva's expression hardened. I'm telling you what is. Your son believes he's correcting a lifetime of being told he wasn't good enough as he was. Your wife suffers because she represents everything Rurik feels you valued more than him. Gunnar shifted uncomfortably, clearly reluctant to interrupt, but growing concerned about time. Wise one, what of the future? What do the runes show of what's to come? Sigrid gathered the bones again, cast them with more force, studied their arrangement with troubled eyes. Blood calls to blood, she said finally. Father and son will face each other when 3 days have passed. But the outcome depends on which man Ulvar chooses to be in that moment. What do you mean? You have lived 2 lives, Ulvar Ironborn. The warrior who carved his name in enemy shields, and the peacemaker who built prosperity from compromise. Your son knows only stories of the first, and has lived under rule of the second. When you face him, which man will hold the blade? The question hung in the air like smoke. Ulvar understood what she was asking. Would he fight as the legendary warrior of his youth, or as the diplomatic leader he had become? What happens if I choose wrong? There is no wrong choice, only consequences. But know this, your son has spent his life preparing to fight the man he thinks you are, not the man you've become. That may be advantage or weakness. And what of the external alliances? The messengers from Orkney? Sigrid's fingers moved to different bones, these telling a darker story. Håkon Ragnarsson comes with ships and steel, but also with hunger that cannot be satisfied by any alliance. Win or lose, he will take what he wants from Elfheim before departing. Meaning, your son has made bargains with wolves, thinking himself their equal. When the feeding begins, he will learn that being useful is not the same as being safe. This was worse than Ulvar had imagined. His son was inviting external predators into their territory, threatening not just Ulvar's authority, but everyone's safety. Can this be prevented? All things can be prevented, Sigrid said, rising with effort. The question is what price you're willing to pay. To save your son, you may have to destroy him. To save your people, you may have to become something you've spent decades avoiding. She moved to a wooden chest and withdrew something wrapped in dark cloth. Your father left this with me before his death, with instructions it should be given to you only in your darkest hour. Ulvar accepted the package with trembling hands. Unwrapping revealed a silver amulet he remembered from childhood, Thor's hammer on a chain of linked wolves. Worn smooth by generations, he said you would know when the time came to remember what you truly are, Sigrid explained. Not the man you chose to become, but the man the gods made you to be. The amulet was warm in his palm, as if it held heat from his father's body. He remembered stories of enemies who fell before him like wheat before a scythe. If I become that man again, Ulvar said quietly, can I ever go back? Some doors, once opened, can never be closed, Sigrid admitted. But sometimes demand doors be opened, regardless of cost. Outside, afternoon was growing late, and Gunnar was anxious about their absence being noticed. But Ulvar had one more question. In your vision, when father faces son, who survives? Sigrid's ancient eyes met his, and in them he saw the weight of prophecy. That depends, she said, on what kind of survival you're asking about. Bodies can live when souls die, and sometimes souls must die, so bodies can find reason to keep living. The words followed them back through shadowed paths toward Gunnar's cottage. But now Ulvar carried more than information. He carried terrible knowledge that this conflict had roots deeper than politics. This was about identity, about the kind of men they both chose to be, about fathers and sons, and wounds passed down like heirlooms. And tomorrow, those wounds would demand their final reckoning. The silver amulet lay heavy against Ulvar's chest as he returned to Gunnar's cottage, its weight seeming to grow with each step. Brynja looked up from her mending as he entered, her eyes finding the chain at his throat. Your father's hammer, she said softly. I thought that was lost. Sigrid kept it safe, Ulvar replied, settling beside her. For darker times than these. And what did the Völva tell you? Ulvar recounted the conversation, watching his wife's face grow troubled. When he finished, Brynja was quiet, her fingers working at torn fabric. She's right about the wounds, Brynja said finally. I saw them growing in Rurik these past years. Every time you praised another man's son, every time you chose diplomacy over force, he heard rejection. But I was teaching him wisdom, and he was trying to show you he could be strong. Brynja touched the amulet through his shirt. Perhaps you were both right and both wrong. Through the window, they could see torches being lit in the great hall. Rurik's celebration continued, keeping his supporters well fed and entertained. There's movement at the harbour. Gunnar reported, returning from reconnaissance. A ship flying Orkney colors anchored beyond the inlet. Hakon's advance party, Ulvar's blood chilled, earlier than expected, by 2 days. Either their sailing was faster, or Rurik accelerated the timeline, which means the formal meeting is tomorrow, not 3 days hence. The implications were staggering. If external allies were arriving, if formal alliances were being concluded tomorrow, then Ulvar's window was closing rapidly. How many men on that ship? Hard to tell, but it's a proper longship. Could carry 40 warriors. 40 trained Orkney fighters, plus Rurik's local support, against Ulvar's handful of loyal men. Direct confrontation was becoming impossible. We need to know exactly what agreements Rurik plans, Ulvar said, and how do we learn that when approaching his inner circle means death? Brynja looked up thoughtfully. There's someone who might know, someone Rurik trusts, but who isn't completely committed. Who? Astrid Thorkelsdottir. She's been serving in the hall, helping with feast preparations. Young, pretty, impressed by Rurik's confidence, but not stupid. If he's been boasting, she would have heard. Ulvar knew the girl, 18 winters old, daughter of a cautious farmer. Smart enough to recognize opportunity, but wise enough to fear consequences. Would she speak with us? She might if approached carefully. She has no love for seeing mothers chained by sons. And she remembers kindnesses from when her father was ill. Can you arrange a meeting? Tonight, after the hall settles. She draws water from the granary well each evening. As darkness fell, Ulvar found himself confronting the strangest evening of his adult life. 3 days ago he had been a respected jarl, returning with wealth. Now he was a fugitive, dependent on old friends' loyalty and servants' possible cooperation. They moved through the settlement like ghosts, using familiar paths now traveled in fear. The granary well stood in a clearing, surrounded by storage buildings, lit by a single torch. Astrid was there as predicted, drawing water efficiently. When she saw them emerge from darkness, her bucket slipped and would have fallen if Gunnar hadn't caught it. "My Lady Brynja," she whispered, looking around nervously. "You shouldn't be here. We need your help, child," Brynja said gently. "I can't be seen talking to you. Rurik has made clear what happens to those who consort with enemies." "We're not enemies," Ulvar said, stepping into torchlight. "I'm the rightful jarl, trying to prevent disaster." Astrid's eyes went wide. She clearly hadn't expected to see him. "You're supposed to be dead," she said without thinking, then clapped a hand over her mouth. "Dead. Rurik told everyone you died in a storm during the voyage home. Said your ship broke up on rocks near Lindisfarne. That's why he assumed authority instead of waiting." The lie was cleverly constructed, explaining Rurik's power while making him seem reluctant rather than ambitious. "What else has he told people?" Brynja asked. "That he grieves deeply but must put duty above personal sorrow. That dangerous times require strong leadership. That loyal service will be rewarded, while clinging to old ways means being left behind. And the Orkney visitors? Trade negotiations, he says. Mutual defense discussions. But I've heard him speaking privately. There's talk of marriage alliances, combining settlements under stronger leadership. And the Orkney men who came ashore don't look like traders." "How many came ashore?" 20, maybe 25. All armed, moving like warriors. They've taken quarters in the old storage house near the harbour, more than Ulvar had feared. If Hakon brought that many as advance party, how many more waited on ships? "Astrid," Brynja said gently, "what do you know of Rurik's plans for his mother?" The girl's expression darkened. "He speaks of you rarely, never kindly. Says you represent old weaknesses that made Elfheim vulnerable. That a leader's family must exemplify strength or be replaced." Replaced? There's talk of annulment. Claims you've grown too old to bear heirs, that the settlement needs a jarl's wife who can produce strong sons. Each word struck like a blade. Rurik was systematically erasing his father's legacy, starting with the marriage that had been Ulvar's happiness foundation. And after annulment, he's negotiating with Hakon about an Orkney chieftain's daughter. Marriage would seal their alliance and provide legitimacy. Complete replacement of the old order with foreign alliances, and destruction of everything Ulvar had built. "Child," Ulvar said quietly, You've been brave telling us this, but now you must choose. Help us prevent disaster, or remain silent and hope chaos doesn't touch you. Astrid's young face was pale, but her voice steady. What would you have me do? Be our eyes and ears. Learn what you can of tomorrow's negotiations, of Rurik's specific promises. And if possible, create opportunities for us to act. What kind of opportunities? Ulvar looked at his wife, then Gunnar, seeing grim determination reflected. The kind that might save Elfheim from foreign domination, even if it costs us everything we hold dear. As they prepared to separate, Astrid caught Brynja's hand. My lady, will you survive this? That depends, Brynja replied, on whether love can triumph over ambition, and whether a father's heart can make the choices a Jarl's mind demands. Walking back through darkness, Ulvar felt his father's amulet's weight and understood tomorrow would demand choosing not just between actions, but between versions of himself. The peaceful Jarl who built prosperity through compromise was running out of time. The warrior his father had been was stirring from decades of sleep. Dawn brought with it a messenger that would change everything. Ulvar thought he understood about his son's betrayal. The boy couldn't have been more than 16 winters. His face pale with exhaustion and fear as Gunnar brought him to the cottage under cover of morning mist. Speak, Ulvar commanded, recognizing the youth as one of the harbor watch, supposedly loyal to Rurik's new order. My lord, the boy gasped, falling to his knees. I bring word from your son, but not the son who rules in the hall. Ulvar's blood froze. What do you mean? Olaf, my lord. Your younger son sends word from the monastery at Lindisfarne. He lives, and he knows of the troubles here. The world seemed to tilt beneath Ulvar's feet. Olaf, his second son, the boy who had chosen the Christian God over the warrior's path, who had sailed to Northumbria 3 years past to study with the monks. Olaf was alive and aware of the crisis in Elfheim. How does he know? Brynja whispered, her face white as bone. We sent no word. Because, my lady, the messenger continued, your eldest son Rurik has been in correspondence with him for months. And the letters... The boy reached into his tunic and withdrew a leather packet. The letters tell a different story than what we've been hearing. With trembling hands, Ulvar broke the seal, an unfolded parchment covered in Olaf's careful script. The words, written in Latin but translated by his educated son, struck like lightning. Beloved father, by the time you read this, you will know that everything you believed about Rurik's betrayal was a lie, constructed to save your life and our people's freedom. The true enemy is not your son, but the man who threatens to destroy us all, Hakon Ragnarsson, who has sworn to take Elfheim by force if it cannot be taken by guile. Ulvar's hand shook as he continued reading, each word reshaping his understanding of everything that had transpired. Rurik discovered Hakon's plot 6 months ago when Orkney merchants let slip details of planned conquest. Hakon intends to eliminate all independent jarls along this coast, replacing them with vassals who will serve his ambition to become High King of the northern settlements. You, father, with your reputation for honor and your network of trading alliances, represent the greatest obstacle to his plans. This cannot be, Brynja breathed, reading over Ulvar's shoulder. But the letter continued, and its contents grew more devastating. Rurik's cruel treatment of you and mother was theater, designed to convince Hakon's spies that Elfheim was already in rebellion against your rule. His assumption of power, his harsh words, even his treatment of mother, all calculated to make Hakon believe that internal strife had already weakened your position. Ulvar's mind reeled. Could this be true? Could his son's betrayal have been an elaborate deception designed to protect rather than destroy? The chains, Gunnar said quietly, understanding beginning to dawn in his weathered eyes. Why would Rurik need to chain Brynja unless he needed to convince hostile observers that she was truly his prisoner? Ulvar finished, pieces falling into place like stones in a wall. But why not tell me? Why let me believe? The answer came from Olaf's letter. Because Hakon has spies everywhere, father, even among those you trust most. The only way to convince him that Elfheim was vulnerable was to make the deception complete, down to the smallest detail. Rurik's supporters are mostly men who know the truth. They play their parts to convince the few who don't. The young warriors who seem so eager for raids, Brynja said, understanding flooding her voice. They weren't seduced by promises of easy wealth. They were following orders to appear seduced. And Eric's arrest? Ulvar read further. Eric was taken not as punishment but as protection. Rurik feared he might reveal the truth inadvertently, so he's been kept safe in the hall's lower chambers while appearing to be imprisoned. The magnitude of the deception was staggering. His son hadn't betrayed him. He had sacrificed his own reputation, his relationship with his parents, his standing in the community, all to protect them from a threat they hadn't even known existed, but the silver from Miklagard. Ulvar asked the messenger boy, "Hidden, my lord. Moved to caves beyond the settlement where Hakon's men cannot find it. Your son told everyone it was claimed for his own use, but actually he's been preserving it to fund resistance if the deception fails." And Astrid? What she told us about marriage alliances? The boy's young face grew troubled. That part is true, my lord, but not as it seems. Rurik has been negotiating, but the agreements include clauses that would make any marriage void if entered under false pretenses. When the truth is revealed, the contracts become worthless. Ulvar felt as if he were drowning in revelations. Every piece of evidence he had gathered, every conversation that had convinced him of his son's treachery, was now being reinterpreted through this new lens. How do we know this isn't another deception? Gunnar asked, ever practical. How do we know Hakon hasn't discovered the plot and turned it to his own advantage? The answer came not from the messenger, but from movement outside the cottage. Through the window they could see armed men approaching, not the rough warriors from Orkney, but familiar figures from Elfheim's guard. "They're coming for us," Brynja whispered, but when the door opened it wasn't enemies who entered. It was Rurik himself, flanked by two men Ulvar recognized as loyal retainers. His son's face was drawn with exhaustion and something deeper, the weight of months spent playing a role that went against his nature. "Father," Rurik said, his voice carrying none of the arrogance Ulvar had heard in the great hall. "We need to talk, and we need to do it quickly. Hakon grows suspicious and our time is running out. Is it true?" Ulvar asked, holding up Olaf's letter. "All of it?" Rurik's eyes, his son's eyes filled with pain and desperate hope, met his. "Every word. I know what you must think of me, what you've been feeling these past days. I know I've hurt you and Mother beyond measure, but it was the only way to keep you alive long enough for us to find a solution. The only way." Brynja's voice was sharp with the memory of chains and thirst and shame. Hakon's original plan was simple assassination, Rurik explained, kneeling beside the bench where his parents sat. "Kill you during your return voyage, make it look like accident or natural causes, then arrive with aid for the grieving settlement. When that failed because you changed your route, he moved to the secondary plan, support internal rebellion that would weaken Elfheim enough for conquest. So you gave him a rebellion to support. A fake one, something that looked real enough to satisfy his spies, but wasn't real enough to actually harm our people. The challenge was making it convincing without..." Rurik's voice broke slightly. "Without destroying my relationship with you forever?" Ulvar looked at his son, truly looked at him for the first time in days. Behind the facade of arrogant usurper, he could see exhaustion, pain, and the weight of terrible choices made for desperate reasons. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now we spring the trap," Rurik said, his voice hardening with resolve. "Hakon thinks he's coming to formalize an alliance with a weak usurper. Instead, he's walking into a settlement where every warrior knows the truth and every plan has been prepared in advance. But there are still real Orkney warriors. Real weapons, real danger." "Yes," Rurik admitted. "The next few hours will determine whether we save Elfheim or die trying. But at least now we face that danger together, as father and son should," looking into Rurik's eyes. Seeing the boy he had raised beneath the mask of deception he had worn, Ulvar felt something shift in his chest. Not forgiveness, that would take time, but understanding, and with it, a father's pride in a son who had been willing to sacrifice everything for the greater good. "Tell me the plan," Ulvar said, his voice carrying the authority of a Jarl speaking to his war leader. "Tell me how we save our people." Outside, morning was advancing toward the hour when Hakon Ragnarsson would discover that the easy conquest he expected had become something far more dangerous. A trap set by a family that had never been broken, only bent toward a purpose he couldn't comprehend. The real battle for Elfheim was about to begin. The plan Rurik outlined was both elegant and terrifying in its complexity. Every detail of the morning's deception had been orchestrated to draw Hakon Ragnarsson into a position where his superior numbers would become a disadvantage rather than strength. "The Great Hall has been prepared," Rurik explained, sketching the layout in the dirt floor with his knife point. 20 of Hakon's men will be invited inside for the formal negotiations, seated at tables that appear ceremonial but are actually positioned to block easy escape routes. Meanwhile, his remaining forces will be quartered in the harbor storage house, a building we've modified over the past week. Modified how? Ulvar asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Fire arrows," Gunnar said grimly, understanding the implications. "Trap them inside, then burn the building around them." "It's not that simple," Rurik corrected. "We need some of them alive to prevent this from looking like a massacre. Hakon must appear to have overreached, to have violated guest right and forced us to defend ourselves. Otherwise, we risk bringing the wrath of every Orkney clan down upon Elfheim." Ulvar studied his son's face, seeing in it a strategic mind he hadn't fully appreciated before. This wasn't the impulsive young warrior he had worried about, but a leader who understood both tactics and consequences. "What of the men inside the hall?" Brynja asked. 20 armed warriors, even surprised, could kill many of our people before being stopped. "That's where father's reputation becomes crucial," Rurik said, meeting Ulvar's eyes. "Hakon expects to negotiate with a weak usurper supported by foreign strength. Instead, he'll find himself facing Ulvar Ironborn, a name that still carries weight even in Orkney. The psychological impact should buy us precious moments. And if it doesn't, then we fight and pray the gods favor justice over treachery." The morning sun was climbing higher, and through the cottage windows they could see increased activity throughout the settlement. Men moving with purpose, women keeping children close to home. The subtle signs of a community preparing for violence while maintaining the appearance of normal daily life. "There's something else," Rurik said hesitantly. "Something I haven't told you about Hakon's true intentions." Ulvar felt his stomach tighten. "What?" "The marriage alliance with the Orkney chieftain's daughter. It's real. But Hakon plans to kill both you and me after the ceremony, claiming we died heroically defending Elfheim against unknown raiders. He would then assume guardianship of the settlement through his new wife, ruling as regent until their children come of age." The audacity of it was breathtaking. Not just conquest, but complete usurpation dressed as legitimate succession. "How do you know this?" "One of his men drinks too much and talks too freely. We've been feeding him ale and listening carefully for weeks." Brynja's hand found Ulvar's, her fingers cold with understanding. "So even if we had simply submitted, we would have died anyway." "Yes. Hakon's path leads to the same destination regardless of our choices. The only difference is whether we fight with dignity or die like sheep." Outside, a horn sounded from the direction of the harbor, the signal that formal negotiations would begin within the hour. The sound seemed to galvanize everyone in the cottage, transforming nervous energy into focused determination. "Positions," Rurik commanded, and Ulvar felt a surge of pride at the authority in his son's voice. "Father, you'll enter the hall through the main doors, just as Hakon begins his opening demands. The shock of seeing you alive should create enough confusion for our people to act. And you? I'll be playing my role as the weak usurper right up until the moment the trap springs. Then, Rurik's hand moved to his sword hilt. "Then I become your son again, and we stand together as we should have all along." Gunnar checked his weapons one final time, the motion automatic after decades of warfare. What of the innocent? Women, children, elders who had no part in any of this? Safe houses have been prepared at the settlement's edge, Rurik assured him. As soon as fighting begins, they'll be evacuated to positions where they can flee into the forest if necessary. And if we lose... If we lose, Ulvar said quietly, fastening his father's amulet outside his shirt where it could be clearly seen, then at least our people will know we died trying to protect them, rather than surrendering to foreign domination. The words carried the weight of finality, but also of purpose. Whatever happened in the next few hours, the people of Elfheim would understand that their leaders had chosen honor over survival, resistance over submission. There's one more thing, Brynja said, rising from the bench with renewed strength. Something that needs to be said before we face whatever comes. Both men looked at her, and in her eyes they saw not the broken woman who had been chained and humiliated, but the steel-spined partner who had helped build Elfheim's prosperity through 20 years of marriage. Rurik, she said, meeting her son's gaze directly. I understand why you did what you did. I even respect the courage it took to sacrifice your own honor for our protection. But if we survive this day, we need to find better ways to communicate in crisis. The pain you caused, to me, to your father, to yourself, was real, even if the reasons were noble. Rurik's face crumpled slightly, the weight of months of isolation finally showing. Mother, you were protecting us, she interrupted gently. I know that. But protection that destroys what it's meant to preserve isn't protection at all. It's just another form of loss. Can you forgive me? I can try, Brynja said honestly. But more importantly, you need to forgive yourself. Whatever happens today, you've proven you're willing to sacrifice everything for those you love. That's not a weakness to be ashamed of. It's the mark of a true leader. The horn sounded again, closer this time. And through the cottage walls, they could hear the measured tread of armed men moving through Elfheim's streets. Hakon Ragnarsson was approaching, confident in his strength and certain of his victory. Time, Rurik said, but his voice was steadier now, strengthened by his mother's words and his father's presence. As they prepared to leave the cottage that had sheltered their reconciliation, Ulvar felt the weight of choice settling on his shoulders one final time. Not the impossible choice between love and justice that had tormented him for days, but the simpler, harder choice between action and inaction, between standing up for what was right and accepting what was expedient. He thought of Sigrid's words about which man would hold the blade when the moment came. The peaceful Jarl who had built prosperity through compromise, or the warrior who had carved his name in enemy shields, looking at his son, his brave, foolish, brilliant son, who had risked everything for a desperate gamble. Ulvar realized the choice wasn't between different men at all. It was about becoming the man this moment demanded. Protector and diplomat, father and leader, someone who could fight when fighting was necessary, but who never forgot what he was fighting for. Ready? Rurik asked. Ready, Ulvar replied, and meant it. Outside, the greatest test of their lives was waiting. But for the first time since returning to Elfheim, Ulvar faced that test not as a father betrayed or a leader overthrown, but as what he had always been meant to be, a man with something worth defending and the strength to defend it. The trap was set. Hakon Ragnarsson was walking into a reckoning 20 years in the making, and the Ironborn family would meet their destiny together, as they always should have. The great hall of Elfheim had never felt more like a trap than when Ulvar approached its familiar doors. Through the timber walls he could hear Hakon Ragnarsson's confident voice, conducting what he believed to be legitimate business. The terms are simple, young Jarl. My protection in exchange for your submission. Your settlement's prosperity in exchange for acknowledgement of my authority. Rurik's reply was perfectly pitched, desperate but not insulting. Your offer is generous. Lord Hakon, but what guarantees do my people have of fair treatment? You have my word, Hakon replied, the lie obvious even through walls. It was time. Ulvar placed his hand on the iron ring, took a breath that tasted of destiny, and stepped into the light. The silence was absolute. 20 Orkney warriors turned to stare at a man they'd been told was dead. Hakon himself, a scarred bear of a man, went rigid in the high seat that had been Ulvar's grandfather's. Rurik's expression showed relief so profound it was almost physical, as if he'd been holding his breath for months. "Hakon Ragnarsson," Ulvar said, his voice carrying a jarl's authority. "I understand you've been negotiating my settlement's future in my absence." Hakon's recovery was swift. "Ulvar Ironborn, reports of your death appear greatly exaggerated. Indeed, almost as exaggerated as your authority to negotiate on Elfheim's behalf." The Orkney warriors shifted restlessly, hands moving toward weapons, held in check by their leader's apparent calm. Hakon seemed to be calculating odds, measuring distances. "Your son has managed affairs admirably. We were discussing mutual defense arrangements. Is that what you call planning to murder a jarl and usurp his authority through false marriage?" The words hit like a physical blow. Several warriors reached for swords, but Hakon's raised hand stopped them. His eyes had gone cold as winter seas. "Accusations require proof, old man. And proof requires witnesses who might not survive." The confirmation Ulvar had hoped for, Hakon abandoning pretense. But also the moment when talking ended and violence began. "The proof is in your own man's words, spoken while drunk on our ale." Hakon's gaze flicked to his warriors, recognition and fury flashing across his features. "Sven, I should have known better than to trust a man who couldn't hold his drink." But even as he spoke, Hakon was moving, not toward Ulvar, but toward Rurik, the younger target, the easier kill. Steel sang as his sword cleared its sheath, and the Orkney warriors erupted into motion. It should have been chaos, but Rurik's preparations were thorough. The tables weren't just positioned to block escape routes. They channeled fighting into predictable patterns. More importantly, not all the men in the hall were enemies. Eric burst from shadows near the kitchen door, very much alive and armed. Behind him came a dozen of Elfheim's warriors, men waiting in concealment for this moment. "For Elfheim!" Eric shouted, his sword taking an Orkney warrior before the man could turn. "For the true Jarl!" Came the answering cry, and Hakon's numerical advantage was evaporating. But Hakon himself was moving toward Rurik, his blade arcing toward his son's throat. Time slowed as Ulvar watched the sword that would take his child's life. Then Ulvar was moving too, his father's war axe appearing in his hands. The weapon that had carved his reputation sang through air, striking Hakon's sword with ringing clash that sent sparks dancing. "You want Elfheim?" Ulvar snarled, pressing forward with relentless advance. "You'll go through its rightful protector first." Hakon was skilled, economical, brutal sword work designed to kill rather than impress. But he fought with desperation of a man whose plans had collapsed into chaos. Around them, battle raged with increasing intensity. But Ulvar's world had narrowed to the space between himself and the man who threatened everything he loved. "You should have stayed dead, old man," Hakon gasped. "Your time is past. The age of soft jarls is ending." "Perhaps," Ulvar replied, his axe opening a red line across Hakon's cheek. "But it ends when we choose, not when jackals decide to feed on weakness that doesn't exist." Through combat chaos, Ulvar caught glimpses of his son fighting 2 Orkney warriors, of Eric carving through enemies who'd expected easy victory but found themselves trapped. The outcome remained in doubt. Despite preparation and surprise, they were still outnumbered, and Hakon was no easy opponent. The Orkney leader's next attack came in a combination that spoke of battlefield experience, thrust toward belly, followed by horizontal cut at neck. It nearly killed Ulvar. Only decades of instinct saved him, his axe coming up in diagonal block that turned the blade aside by inches. But the movement left him overextended, and Hakon's follow-up strike was already coming toward exposed ribs. This was how warriors died, in split seconds where skill met luck and one proved insufficient. But as Hakon's blade descended toward what should have been killing blow, another sword intervened. Rurik having dispatched his opponents, stepped into the gap with perfect timing, catching Hakon's blade long enough for Ulvar to recover. Together, "Father," Rurik said, voice steady despite blood running down his sword arm, as it should have been from the beginning. Father and son, fighting side by side against an enemy who'd threatened to destroy everything they held dear. It felt like the natural order being restored after too long in chaos. Fighting together, father and son became something greater than the sum of their individual skills. Ulvar's experience and Rurik's youth complemented each other perfectly. Where the older man's reflexes might have been a heartbeat slow, his son's quicker movements covered the gap. Where Rurik's aggression might have led him into overextension, his father's wisdom held him back. Hakon found himself facing not one opponent, but a coordinated team that seemed to anticipate each other's movements with supernatural precision. His sword, which had served him well in countless single combats, struggled to find openings against their combined defense. "Impossible," he snarled, parrying a strike from Ulvar, only to immediately face Rurik's blade coming from an unexpected angle. "You're just an old trader and his whelp." "We're Ironborn," Rurik replied, his sword describing a silver arc that forced Hakon back another step. "And this is our home." Around them the tide of battle was turning decisively. The Orkney warriors, trapped in an unfamiliar hall, with enemies emerging from concealment on multiple sides, were falling one by one. Their superior numbers meant nothing when they couldn't bring their full strength to bear in the confined space. But Hakon himself remained dangerous. Desperate men fought with fury that could overcome skill, and his next attack came with berserker intensity, a wild series of strikes that drove both Ulvar and Rurik backward toward the great fireplace. "Even if you kill me," Hakon gasped between attacks, "my ships still control your harbor. My remaining men still hold your people hostage. Surrender now and I'll make your deaths quick." "Your men," Ulvar replied, blocking a vicious overhead strike, "are about to discover that storage houses burn very well when filled with the right materials." As if summoned by his words, the sound of fire reaching the harbor drifted through the hall's windows. Shouts of alarm, the crackle of flames, the confused noise of men caught completely off guard by an attack they hadn't anticipated. Hakon's face went pale as he realized the full extent of the trap that had been laid for him. This wasn't just a failed negotiation. This was the complete destruction of his invasion force. "You planned this from the beginning," he accused, his swordwork becoming more frantic as understanding dawned. "All of it, the rebellion, the weakness, the internal strife." "My son planned it," Ulvar said with fierce pride. "While you saw opportunity in our apparent discord, he saw your invasion coming and prepared accordingly." The admission seemed to break something in Hakon's spirit. His attacks became wilder, less controlled, the movements of a man who knew he was beaten but refused to accept defeat gracefully. It was that desperation that created the opening. Ulvar had been waiting for Hakon's next strike, came with all his remaining strength behind it, a blow meant to cleave through both father and son with a single swing. But desperation made him overcommit, put too much force behind the attack, left him unable to recover quickly when Ulvar's axe caught his blade and turned it aside. For a heartbeat, Hakon stood exposed, his sword out of position. His guard completely open, Ulvar could have killed him then. Should have, perhaps. The war axe was already moving, already committed to a strike that would end the threat once and for all. But at the last moment, something stayed his hand. Not mercy, Hakon deserved none. Not hesitation about the necessity of his death, but the understanding that this moment would define not just the battle, but who Ulvar chose to be in his son's eyes. Instead of the killing blow, Ulvar's axe struck Hakon in the temple, hard enough to drop him unconscious. Not hard enough to kill. "Yield," Ulvar commanded the remaining Orkney warriors, his voice carrying across the hall. "Your leader is defeated, your ships are burning, your invasion has failed. Lay down your weapons and live." The silence that followed was profound. Around the hall, the last few enemy warriors looked at their unconscious leader, at the Elfheim men surrounding them, at the futility of continued resistance. One by one, They dropped their swords. "Father," Rurik said quietly, "why didn't you kill him?" Ulvar looked at his son, seeing in his eyes the question that went deeper than tactics or mercy. Why choose restraint when vengeance was justified? Why show honor to an enemy who had shown none? "Because," Ulvar replied, "the man you will become is shaped by the choices you see me make. I'd rather you remember this day as the moment we chose to be protectors rather than executioners." Through the hall's windows, they could see the glow of fires at the harbor beginning to subside. The sounds of battle were fading, replaced by the voices of their people, calling out that the threat was ended. The enemy defeated, but it was the look in his son's eyes, respect, understanding, pride, that told Ulvar the real victory had been won. Not just over external enemies, but over the forces that might have torn their family apart. "The settlement is secure?" he asked Eric, who was binding wounds on the surviving Orkney prisoners. "Secure, my lord. The harbor fires contained the enemy forces as planned. We took minimal casualties, mostly wounded, few dead. And our people? Safe. The evacuation plans worked perfectly. Women and children were clear of danger before fighting began." Ulvar nodded, feeling the weight of leadership settling back onto his shoulders, not as burden this time, but as responsibility gladly accepted. "Then let's see to our wounded and decide what justice looks like for men who would have conquered us through treachery." As father and son walked together toward the hall's doors, stepping over scattered weapons and unconscious enemies, Ulvar felt the silver amulet warm against his chest. His father's hammer carried through darkness to this moment of triumph. The warrior and the peacemaker had found a way to coexist. The Ironborn family had survived its greatest test, and Elfheim would endure, stronger for the trials it had faced. 3 days after the battle, Elfheim felt like itself again. The Great Hall had been cleaned of blood and restored to its proper purpose, a place of justice and celebration rather than warfare. Smoke no longer rose from the harbor where Hakon's ships had burned, and the sound of children's laughter once again echoed through the settlement's paths. Ulvar sat in his rightful place at the high table, but the seat beside him was no longer empty. Rurik had earned his position there through courage, wisdom, and sacrifice that went far beyond what should be asked of any son. The young man, who had once seemed hungry for power, now wielded it with the restraint that marked true leadership. "The prisoners?" Ulvar asked, accepting a cup of ale from Brynja, who wore no chains now, but the silver wedding ring that had bound them for 23 years. "Hakon himself sails for Orkney tomorrow," Rurik reported. "Alive, as you commanded, but carrying word that Elfheim is under the protection of men who understand both mercy and strength. The others have been given the same choice, departure or service, but no middle ground. And the ships that survived? 2 longships remain seaworthy. We've allowed Hakon to take one, with minimal crew and provisions for the journey home. The other remains here as compensation for the damage his invasion attempt caused." Ulvar nodded approvingly. Justice tempered with pragmatism, exactly the kind of decision he might have made himself. But coming from his son rather than his own calculations. Brynja settled beside them, her presence a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything that mattered. The physical wounds from her ordeal had healed quickly, but Ulvar knew the deeper scars would take time to fade. "Any word from Olaf?" she asked. "His ship was sighted this morning," Rurik replied with the first genuine smile Ulvar had seen from him in months. "Your younger son returns from his monastery with tales of the southern lands and a request to establish a small scriptorium here in Elfheim." "A scriptorium?" Ulvar raised an eyebrow. "Whatever for?" "To preserve our history," Brynja said softly. "To ensure that the story of how this family nearly destroyed itself through misunderstanding, then saved itself through truth, is never forgotten." The wisdom in that struck Ulvar immediately. How many other fathers and sons had destroyed each other because they lacked the words to say what needed saying? How many communities had fallen to external threats because internal conflicts made them vulnerable? "The Völva came to see me this morning," Rurik said, his voice carrying new respect for the old woman's wisdom. "She said the runes show calm waters ahead, but reminded me that storms are part of the natural order. They test our strength, but they also cleanse what has grown stagnant." "What did you tell her?" "That I've learned the difference between strength and stubbornness, between leadership and domination. That the next storm to threaten Elfheim will find us prepared. But not because we've grown hard, because we've grown wise." Through the great hall's windows, they could see the settlement's people going about their daily work with the kind of purposeful energy that marked a community that had faced crisis and emerged stronger. Children played games of warriors and jarls, but their play was gentler somehow, more focused on protection than conquest. "There's something I need to say," Ulvar began, setting down his cup and looking directly at his son, "about the choice you made, about the price you paid to protect us all." Rurik started to speak, but Ulvar held up a hand. "I spent too many years trying to make you into a reflection of myself, instead of helping you become the best version of who you were meant to be. I see now that your instincts for decisive action, your willingness to make hard choices, your understanding of when strength is necessary, these aren't flaws to be corrected. They're gifts to be honored, Father. The plan you devised, the risks you took, the isolation you endured, all of it showed a kind of courage I'm not sure I possessed at your age. Perhaps not even now." Rurik's eyes were bright with emotion he was trying to control. "I made so many mistakes, hurt people I loved, nearly destroyed everything I was trying to save." "You did what leaders do," Brynja said gently. "You made the best choices you could with the information you had, and you accepted responsibility for the consequences. That's not a burden to be ashamed of. It's the mark of someone ready to bear the weight of others' welfare. And now?" Rurik asked. "What happens now?" Ulvar smiled, feeling years of worry and tension lifting from his shoulders like morning mist. "Now we lead together. Now we build on what we've learned. Now we make sure that the next time our people face danger, they face it united rather than divided. The next time. There will be a next time," Ulvar said, with the certainty of a man who had lived through enough history to understand its patterns. "There are always ambitious men looking for easy conquest, always storms that test the foundations we've built. But they'll find us ready as afternoon lengthened toward evening, as the great hall filled with the sounds of their people sharing stories and planning for tomorrow's work." Ulvar felt a deep contentment settle over him. Not the peace of a man whose troubles were ended, but the satisfaction of someone who had rediscovered what made life worth defending. His wife beside him, bearing the strength that had carried her through betrayal and chains to emerge unbroken. His son beside him, ready to inherit not just authority but the wisdom to use it well. His people around him, secure in their knowledge that their leaders would protect them without destroying what made their community worth preserving. Outside, the fjords reflected the last light of day like hammered silver, and the wind carried the scent of home, salt air and growing things, and the smoke of hearth fires where families gathered in safety. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new tests of character and resolve. But tonight, Elfheim rested secure in the knowledge that some bonds were stronger than ambition, some truths deeper than deception, and some loves powerful enough to survive even the worst misunderstandings. Tonight, the Ironborn family was whole again, and that was enough.